And now to our 10 News special investigation. The Tampa Housing Authority recently upgraded their headquarters, and it cost $2 million more than the board was told it would.
Yeah, and while the Housing Authority is living sweet in their new building, 10 News investigator Mike Deason shows you some struggling families are living in unfit conditions.
It's a tale of two buildings, paint peeling off the walls and ceiling, versus plush landscaping and fountains. In one, steamy apartments with no central air. In the other, plush conference rooms with fancy artwork. Cracks in the walls here. Fancy lounge areas with expensive company chairs there. These are two properties with the same owner, the Tampa Housing Authority. They're less than 5 miles away from one another, but worlds apart. And you paid for them both.
The plugs don't work, the refrigerators don't work. The paint in here gets my daughter sick.
This woman, we'll call her Lisa, was afraid to have her face on camera. She lives here in the North Boulevard Public Housing Project. Lisa's upset that the Housing Authority has moved into new headquarters while her family's home lies in disrepair. Others in public housing, like Tim, feel the same way.
Much more could be done for the residents than what's being done over there for that new Taj Mahal.
The Taj Mahal he's referring to is a former office building on Cypress Boulevard in the West Shore area. The Housing Authority bought the building in 2010 for $4.2 million, but the CEO said they would still need even more money for renovation.
I think the initial estimates before we actually got into the building was probably close to $1 million.
But Housing Authority Chief Financial Officer Andy Libby admits it didn't exactly work out that way.
If you add in all the other amenities that had to or didn't have to be put in, we're well over 2.5 million, approaching 3, correct?
Well, if you add in all of those soft costs.
But those soft costs add up. In the end, the whole building will cost in excess of $7 million hard dollars, your tax dollars. And that doesn't sit well with those in public housing.
I think a waste of money to purchase a brand new building and to continue to upgrade that building when so much more could be done right here in public housing.
But Libby says residents like Lisa and her North Boulevard neighbors should be patient because the authority plans to fix up her community in a few years.
It's going to be transformed. We're working as hard as we can to do that.
You have a date?
We would hope in the next couple of years we could move forward with that. Funding is a challenge.
But funding is less of a challenge for the man in charge of the Tampa Housing Authority. Housing Authority CEO Jerome Ryans earns $214,000 a year, even though federal regulations say a Housing Authority director cannot be paid more than $155,000 in federal funds.
But it's taxpayer dollars that he's getting paid with.
It is federal taxpayer dollars, yes.
And while every dollar of Ryan's salary starts out as federal HUD money, the Housing Authority has found an almost magical way to get around that $155,000 limit. Here's how it works. Every month, another agency in the Housing Authority, the North Tampa Development Housing Corporation, receives thousands of dollars from HUD. It waves a magic wand over that money and says, presto changeo. This is no longer federal money, and it pays Ryans an extra $59,000.
I don't apologize for my salary to anybody, and I'm through with it.
But what about the $155,000 cap that HUD says?
We're going to ask you extra for the property, please. Thank you. We're going to ask you to leave.
This is a public.
I'm sorry, guys. This is a private parking area.
But the security chief was wrong. It was a public area. However, Ryans ran back inside rather than answer questions about his headquarters building or salary. But Lisa and those living in public housing want to know why the authority is focusing on new plush headquarters while they live in rundown buildings.
I want better, but right now, times are hard. We are struggling, so if that's the case, then come and do something to these apartments. Spend the millions in these apartments. for us to have something better.
The Housing Authority says the money for the new building comes from a different account than the money for the public housing units. But critics still say they don't understand the fancy digs. And in regards to Ryan's salary, get this. According to materials the Tampa Housing Authority provided us, getting around the $155,000 salary cap is not THA's idea alone. They say HUD even has guidelines for how agencies can defederalize money in order to pay salaries beyond the cap. You can count the 10 News investigators will stay on top of this.
News at 11.
Good evening, I'm Heather Van Ness.
And I'm Reginald Roundtree. Thank you for joining us. Money is tight at the Tampa Housing Authority. The agency says that they're having trouble making ends meet.
But the 10 News investigators found that the THA, whose mission is to help poor families put a roof over their heads, is not having any problems putting their own staff in fancy hotels all across the country. 10 News investigator Mike Deason crunched the numbers and has a story you'll see only on 10.
The Tampa Housing Authority gets $79 million a year to provide for Tampa's most needy citizens, some who are living in less than desirable public housing. But the authority says it's struggling to do more with less.
We're still expected to do the same thing that we've been doing in public housing for the last 10 years with less money. We can't continue to maintain public housing as we see it today based on our funding level.
While the THA is singing the blues over funding cuts, the agency still seems to have plenty of money for travel. From the streets of San Francisco to the French Quarter in New Orleans, from Nashville, the Music City, to the windy city of Chicago, New York, Savannah, Washington, D.C., Charleston, Boston. The investigators analyzed the agency records. In the past 3 years, the Tampa Housing Authority has spent more than $500,000 on travel and training and is budgeted to spend $234,000 this year alone. And despite budget cuts, the THA still increased next year's travel budget to $306,000. That's up more than 30%. The investigators also reviewed other agencies within the same 3-year time period. While the Tampa Housing Authority was spending almost $504,000, we discovered it was 64% more on travel and training than the Miami-Dade Housing Authority. Miami-Dade spent $307,000 in the same time period, while operating on a budget almost 5 times larger.
Things are changing.
Records reveal Tampa Housing CEO Jerome Ryans has spent more than $28,000 in the past 3 years traveling to conferences. And you've spent the past 3 years with more than several hundred. Well, I would like to know from you about the hundreds of thousands of dollars you allowed. We've seen this before. Ryans ran from us earlier this year when we questioned him about his salary.
I don't apologize for my salary to anybody, and I'm through with it.
We also wanted to ask Ryans why taxpayers picked up the bill for valet parking for him in Orlando, or Best of Boston tours for board members and staff, or why several staffers stayed at expensive hotels, in some cases for up to $400 a night. Dr. Harvey, you're the chairman of the board. The board itself has spent almost $100,000 in taxpayer money going to San Francisco, to Boston, to New Orleans. Is that appropriate when the Housing Authority...
I don't have a comment. Thank you.
And so the taxpayers don't have a right to know about this?
They can come to this office anytime they want to.
But the king of travel is the number 2 man in the agency, Leroy Moore. Moore has spent more than $60,000 of public money traveling to conferences in the past 3 years. Mr. Moore, which city did you enjoy the most on the taxpayers' dime? San Francisco, Boston, New Orleans, Chicago, New York?
Mike Deason, you've received all of our reports for the last 5 years. It shows that this housing authority spent between $160,000 and $180,000 a year on travel and training. You're really being obnoxious. I don't know why your station allows you to continue to put out this junk, but it's really running thin.
But what is really running thin is the budget at the Tampa Housing Authority, which readily admits because of cuts it may not be able to provide the same degree of services for its residents, some of whom live in these rundown, unair-conditioned apartments, while at the same time some board and staff members booked rooms at golf and beach resorts so they could attend conferences on the taxpayer dime. You spent $60,000.
Do you want to continue to be obnoxious?
Will you answer the question?
I've answered your question.
But there are more questions to be answered. U.S. Senator Charles Grassley of Iowa says he is shocked by what he calls excessive travel by public housing authorities across the United States. Now the senator is calling for an investigation into the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which provides the majority of funding for the Tampa Housing Authority. And you can bet that the 10 News investigators will stay on top of this and let you know what happens.
I'm Reginald Roundtree.
And I'm Heather Van Est.
We begin tonight with a big development in an investigation that we have been following for some time. A senior U.S. senator is questioning some of the Tampa Housing Authority's spending for questionable expenses.
And this probe into HUD comes after a series of stories by 10 News investigator Mike Deason. He joins us now with much more. Mike?
Well, Heather and Reg, Senator Charles Grassley wrote this scathing letter to the Secretary of HUD blasting the Tampa Housing Authority for numerous items we've uncovered, including $860,000 spent on travel and training since 2009, which Grassley says appears to have surpassed other housing authorities. And Grassley says it gives the impression of being an excuse to take expensive vacations paid with taxpayer dollars. And that resulted in staff and board members spending more than 500 workdays outside the office. The senator blasts the $214,000 salary of CEO Jerome Ryans, which exceeds the mandatory salary cap by almost $60,000. He questions the new $7 million administrative office, and he asks why the agency has spent $800,000 on salary and benefits for a public relations department, but has to hire a $170,000 PR consultant. And he's concerned about the $2.8 million in legal fees to an outside lawyer who is also married to a housing authority employee.
There's people with high salaries, people living high on the hog, people just having a merry time, when there's people that are homeless that could be living there. And your story alerted me to it. And when you have all this amount of money that's spent on going to conferences, I think some $860,000 is what I've heard. Every dollar that goes to airfare, meals, lodging, conference fees is another dollar that can't be used to help house homeless Tampa Bay residents.
Now, the Tampa Housing Authority, which refused to go on camera, issued a statement saying it's well managed, its travel is reasonable, the $7 million building was a necessity, and CEO Jerome Ryan's salary, they say, is reasonable and board approved. However, we found that the authority uses creative accounting to get around federal rules, and Senator Grassley agrees with us.
I'm sure you'll have much more. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, is opening a full-blown financial investigation into the Tampa Housing Authority.
Now, this investigation comes after a series of reports by the 10 News investigators. Today, our Mike Deason talked to the Secretary of HUD, hoping to get more answers.
With 9,000 people on the waiting list, the Tampa Housing Authority is having a hard time finding space for some of Tampa's neediest families to go into unair-conditioned apartments. But the 10 News investigators crunched the numbers. We found the THA had plenty of money for some things, like buying and remodeling its new headquarters building at a cost of $7 million taxpayer dollars, paying the agency's CEO, Jerome Ryans, $214,000 a year in salary, and hundreds of thousands of dollars for travel by the board and staff. Today, we caught up with U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Sean Donovan. HUD provides most of the money for THA. Mr. Secretary, as you are aware, we've done a series of stories questioning some of the expenditures of the Tampa Housing Authority. Can you tell me what HUD's position is on that?
All I can say is that we are looking at investigating it, and as a result, I don't have any comment on it today.
Leroy Moore, the second in command at THA, has spent more on travel than anyone else. But today, Moore claimed to be delighted that HUD is investigating the agency's spending practices. Mr. Moore, you told me my investigation had no merit. HUD is now doing a full financial investigation of the Tampa Housing Authority. What is your position now?
We welcome credible organizations to come in and look at our records because you're not credible. We absolutely applaud it.
You applaud it. So
we applaud the Secretary.
Okay.
While HUD Secretary Sean Donovan couldn't address the investigation, HUD officials in D.C. told me this morning there will be a full-blown financial audit of the Housing Authority. In addition, the agency is in for more scrutiny because U.S. Senator Charles Grassley of Iowa is also calling for action. Grassley is concerned about money being wasted on THA travel, the building, and the fact that CEO Ryan's $214,000 salary is almost $60,000 above the HUD maximum. Reg?
The 10 News investigators exposed questionable spending at the Tampa Housing Authority, and now federal investigators are involved, and they want answers. Federal Housing and Urban Development inspectors were in Tampa this week. They want to know why board members are spending money on pricey offices or expensive trips when some THA residents are living in shoddy conditions. 10 News investigator Mike Deason talks to the people who are counting on the THA to help them and not themselves.
This is it, right?
Yeah, this is it. This is the living room. It's supposed to be the kitchen. Fortunately, the kitchen's so small I didn't put a kitchen table, but this is it.
Reva Iman calls this cramped Robles Park apartment home. The Robles complex is a Tampa Housing Authority project that's run down with boarded up apartments and no money for amenities.
So no air conditioning, no screens so you can open the windows. What's it like in a summer here?
Hot. Very hot.
But with the recent cold spell, Iman learned how to get cool air in her apartment. She turned on the heater.
It blows cold air and not heat.
And that is exactly why the Tampa Housing Authority is taking heat this week, as HUD inspectors are going over the agency's financials after the 10 News investigators started asking questions.
We welcome credible organizations to come in and look at our records because you're not credible.
While Leroy Moore, the chief financial officer, doesn't think our reports are credible, HUD clearly does. In the past several months, we've uncovered THA over budget on its $7 million new office building, hundreds of thousands spent on travel and training, and paying the CEO more than allowed by Congress. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Sean Donovan, ordered the probe, and U.S. Senator Charles Grassley started asking questions.
Every dollar that goes to airfare, meals, lodging, conference fees is another dollar that can't be used to help house homeless Tampa Bay residents.
This internal THA email we obtained shows that even employees of the agency are upset.
The executives upstairs, they're all on these fancy trips with new iPhones and iPads, and we can't even get a damn raise.
Why take this money and do all these other things when you know that these places need to be fixed up, these places need, it's awful.
But even after our questions, the Tampa Housing Authority continues what some call frivolous spending, including one party last month, an event even employees are concerned about.
Really? With all the crap Deason is putting us through, now they are having a party?
Head maintenance man told me to keep a bowl or something there to catch the water that drips down out of the refrigerator.
Now Reva Iman is pouring the water down the drain to keep her refrigerator from breaking down for the third time, the same way some say THA continues to pour money down the drain.
This has to stop. This has to stop.
Several people in public housing are telling us the same thing, but are afraid to speak out on camera. And the disparity between the THA headquarters and the rundown apartments is driven home when you consider the living room and kitchen of Reva Iman's place is just a little bit larger than CEO Jerome Ryan's office, and that doesn't count his private bathroom. And that disparity on how Tampa Housing Authority is spending its money and the way residents live is part of the reason HUD officials are in Tampa this week investigating THA. And you can count that the 10 News investigators will stay on top of it.
Federal investigators are still going over Tampa Housing Authority records as a result of our stories for what some are calling excessive spending. But this is not the first time the Tampa Housing Authority CEO, Jerome Ryans, has had questions over how his agency spends tax dollars. As 10 News investigator Mike Deason has uncovered, it also happened when Ryans was CEO of the Memphis Housing Authority.
The audit goes back to 1997, to the time when Jerome Ryans was the CEO of the Memphis Housing Authority. The Office of Inspector General of the Department of Housing and Urban Development produced this scathing 56-page report on Ryan's agency. Among other things, the audit found Ryan's agency was not fulfilling its primary mission of providing decent, safe, and sanitary housing for low-income families. A significant factor, it said, in the deterioration was poor maintenance, poor planning, in short, poor management. And while the inspectors admitted the issues were old and not fully the fault of the current management, they also found the current management must bear some responsibility given their length of tenure. One published report has Ryan's blasting the audit, saying as a whole it was a sloppy job by the HUD auditors. Meantime, the Tampa Housing Authority released this statement, where it doesn't deny or dispute the findings in Memphis, but it says it's unreasonable to compare it to the Tampa Housing Authority today. THA says it's been designated a high-performing agency. However, U.S. Senator Charles Grassley says that doesn't matter, and Tampa is guilty of spending taxpayer dollars for questionable expenses. 10 News investigators will stay on top of this, and there's much more to come.
New information tonight. The Tampa Housing Authority is blasting our reports that led to a HUD audit, which claims gave the agency a clean bill of health. But 10 investigates the audit and finds that's not true. And a U.S. Senator is still blasting the Tampa Housing Authority. 10 investigator Mike Deason has got the details of the audit.
This HUD audit is a result of our investigation into the Tampa Housing Authority. And while it didn't find any illegal activity, the auditors did say the more than $743,000 spent on travel in the past 3 years must be reduced if revenues decrease as expected. However, the authority has budgeted for more travel next year. Of the travel expense files the auditors looked at, there were problems in more than half of them, including no receipts, missing signatures on travel forms, and no airline printouts. The agency is told to modify the travel policy to get the best hotel rates in the area and provide documentation that travel is necessary. The auditors also say going forward, the Housing Authority will have difficulties maintaining the costs of executive salaries. And while the Housing Authority blasts what it calls our spurious and salacious reports, pointing to the fact the audit says it saved $3 million by moving into an existing building and renovating it at a cost of $7 million. Former Mayor Pam Iorio and Agency Commissioner Ruben Padgett argued when the agency wanted to move its headquarters that it didn't need the new office building and should be focusing on creating more affordable housing for the poor.
Meantime, U.S. Senator Charles Grassley, who's been following our investigation, says, I am extremely disappointed the audit justifies egregious spending at the Tampa Housing Authority. Grassley says he's convinced that HUD regional offices don't conduct much, if any, oversight of local housing authorities, choosing instead to accept management documents at face value.
Now, according to Grassley, THA shouldn't celebrate what he calls a cursory review that glossed over significant spending problems. He says wasteful spending is wasteful spending, and he says, be assured that I will continue to pursue my investigation. Be assured, so will we.
Well, new tonight as 10 investigates the Tampa Housing Authority's spending practices. Our stories are now drawing national attention in Washington, D.C. As investigator Mike Deason explains, the U.S. Senate is being told what we uncovered about the Tampa Housing Authority.
As 10 investigates the Tampa Housing Authority, more questions and outrage keep surfacing. Now on the floor of the U.S. Senate, Senator Charles Grassley is calling the Tampa Housing Authority one of the most egregious for wasteful spending.
But while no one is watching, so much of the money gets spent on high salaries and perks for the people who run the Housing Authority.
And that's what we discovered as our investigation found Tampa Housing Authority executives exceeding the federal salary cap through what Grassley calls creative accounting. We exposed a new multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art building which some, including former Mayor Pam Iorio, said was not needed.
The Tampa Housing Authority purchased a new $7 million administrative office that includes nearly $3 million in renovations and upgrades. That could have helped hundreds of, if not thousands, of poor people needing the housing.
We also spent weeks analyzing documents showing THA spent $860,000 for traveling to conferences and training since 2009.
$860,000 that could have been used to provide affordable housing for low-income people.
And Grassley says HUD must reel in wasteful agencies like the Tampa Housing Authority.
If you just hand this money out with no strings and no oversight, it gets diverted and misused.
Meantime, THA says it is helping the poor and complying with the law, but this isn't going away. Much more to come.
When agencies spend millions of your tax dollars, you hope they follow the rules and spend the money wisely. But 10 investigates the Tampa Housing Authority, which gave a multi-million-dollar contract to an organization that wasn't licensed to do the work. Investigator Mike Deason, who has told us about several spending problems with the Housing Authority, has the latest.
Welcome to Cedar Point Apartments, a $6 million Tampa Housing Authority project which is being renovated with good intentions. The plan to get some of public housing residents out of decrepit, outdated, unair-conditioned apartments and into a new home. Reva Iman lives in one of those rundown complexes.
It is really awful what we, the people that are living here, is going through.
Families were scheduled to move into Cedar Point last August, but the project sits as vacant and the 4 lease signs are being removed because it's still not ready.
You know, makes me wonder what they're doing over there.
This contractor, who was one of the higher bidders for the project here at Cedar Point, asked us to conceal his identity because he bids on several public projects and doesn't want to be blackballed. But he says in June of 2012, when the Housing Authority selected the contractor ZMG Malthus, it was done through what he calls a questionable process.
Very challenging.
Questions surfaced after several contractors made bids for the project, and the Housing Authority said in this memo, after a thorough review and due diligence on the part of the Housing Authority, ZMG Malthus submitted the lowest and most responsible bid. That would be nice if it was true.
But they were not a licensed contractor at the time. Should have never made it past the review process.
So we went to Housing Authority CEO Jerome Ryans.
Mr. Ryans, what kind of due diligence was there when you guys hired a venture that wasn't licensed in the state of Florida? Was that due diligence?
Great project. You're talking about Cedar Point. Great
Cedar
project.
Point.
Great project.
But Ryans wouldn't answer any questions. Meantime, a losing bidder protested, and THA did discover ZMG Malthus was not licensed and not qualified to bid. However, THA didn't give the contract to the second qualified bidder. They rejected all the bids, rebid, and then gave the bid back to ZMG Malthus once they obtained a valid license.
Unusual that it all took place around their licensing getting in order.
Then more questions surfaced after one of the men in charge of ZMG Malthus in Cedar Point, Richard Zahn, was convicted in South Carolina for bribery charges on another project. Zahn immediately retired from the company, but the Housing Authority CEO didn't want to talk about that either.
And when Mr. Zahn was arrested, did that concern you?
But those who are suffering the most are people like Reva Iman, waiting to get into decent housing.
It's not fair to the people.
Meantime, the Tampa Housing Authority says it's planning a Cedar Point opening in the next 60 days. The agency also says, even though it didn't catch that ZMG Malthus wasn't licensed, it says in all respects this procurement process was handled in an exemplary manner in accordance with all laws, policies, and procedures, and the agency says we vehemently deny any assertion to the contrary. We also thought you'd want to know that ZMG and Malthus didn't want to comment on this story, but they also have close ties with the Housing Authority as they're major players for the $800 million Encore project, which is the key to Tampa's urban renewal.
Welcome to the plush Tampa Housing Authority headquarters, which is running millions of dollars over budget in renovations, while many in public housing are living in deplorable conditions.
Much more could be done for the residents than what's being done over there for that new Taj Mahal.
I'm not sure that's the best place for a housing authority to be.
For the first time since we began investigating the Tampa Housing Authority, Tampa Mayor Bob Buckhorn is expressing his concern.
Had I been the mayor, or been in office at the time, I'm not sure the decision to buy that building was the best decision.
Buckhorn's concerns are echoed by U.S. Senator Charles Grassley, who wrote this scathing letter to HUD Secretary Sean Donovan. Grassley is upset because HUD called the new building a prudent decision, saying it would only cost $5 million to buy and renovate when a new building would cost $9 million. But that wasn't the case. THA has now spent more than $9 million as the renovations continue on the building.
The Housing Authority can never lose sight of what its mission is, and that is to serve people who are in need.
Buckhorn and Grassley also question why the Housing Authority spent nearly $1 million on travel and training since 2009.
$860,000 that could have been used to provide affordable housing for low-income people.
U.S. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida is also concerned about the information we have uncovered, saying his office has requested information from THA following our reports and after a meeting with Grassley.
We welcome credible organizations to come in and look at our records because you're not credible.
The Housing Authority Chief Operating Officer Leroy Moore has been saying that for months and defends the Tampa Housing Authority by saying HUD rates it as a high-performing agency. But 10 Investigates has discovered several high-performing rated housing authorities around the nation are in trouble with the federal government for mismanaging funds.
You know, that's public money that you're dealing with. Hopefully with stories like this, if that administration has lost its focus, it will regain its focus.
Mayor Buckhorn, who appoints board members who oversee the Housing Authority, says he hopes that they will question how this money is being spent. But the board appears to go along with whatever the authority wants. 10 Investigates has been reporting there's a $155,000 congressionally mandated cap on executive director salaries, but the CEO at the Tampa Housing Authority makes $214,000, and the board just recently voted to give him a $6,000 bonus. Until that is, we pointed out, it appeared to violate state law, and the $6,000 had to be returned. Mike Deason, 10 Investigates.